Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to immediately hand over the mic to Barbara Putz-Plecko. Barbara is the Vice Dean of our university and also responsible for international collaborations and international projects. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Baerbel, for inviting me to speak here, and welcome to everybody, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers, dear colleagues and friends. Let me extend a warm welcome to you at the beginning of a surely very interesting symposium on the relevant and burning topic of displacement. And I do this also on behalf of the university. We are here surrounded by an exhibition showing us structures that give people, refugees, forced to run away, to leave everything behind, to flee their country because of violence and war, and persecution of reasons of race, tribal and social affiliation, religion, nationality, political opinions, temporary shelter, a place to be. For some of them, it might become a temporary home, a transitorial space. For others, it becomes a container of permanent temporariness on a lifelong journey. But my earlier description as us being surrounded by this exhibition is not precise enough. We are not only surrounded. We are part of it. We are participants. We must never understand us being outside of these dynamics because we are always sharing them. And we have to be aware of and ask ourselves which decisions we make, on which basis, on what conditions, how we participate. Reviewing, for example, a day like yesterday, the experiences of that day do not just let me think and reflect, but also intensely feel this necessity of asking me this question. To describe my day, when I started the day by listening to reports on the Turkish government war against Kurds in the Syrian border region. And at the same time looking at that picture on the front page of one of our newspapers, showing Kurdish civilians fleeing from the Turkish troops, a family of 5 on a motorbike. What will their future be like? Then hearing about the ongoing exploratory talks of our government, knowing how important the positioning regarding the migration topic will be for the final political decision, and everything that comes with that. Later, moving on, changing to my office here at the university, which is in the building opposite this one. By doing so, I was entering a building which only 4 or 5 years ago offered a bed to sleep and temporary housing for sometimes even more than 1,500 people per night. Where are they now? Where did they find something to stay? Where is their present? And where is their future? And how do we relate to it? In the afternoon, meeting with a colleague of Turkish origin, talking about her despair and rage that she feels in the face of current developments and what a load of stress this creates for her. Not only personal relationships with Syrian artists and friends, far beyond that. Later, coming here, getting introduced to this very ambitious project at the Harsham camp with all its implications, and thank you, Baerbel, and all collaborators for this work you did and the commitment you shared. I took a lot with me. For example, these words of Tony Chakar were lingering. You find them here. all our space was inside. An inside that had no outside, like a dream. We lived in a time warp for a couple of months, where the past invaded the present, and where the present had no future. Finally, it had been a long day yesterday, returning home, having a short glimpse at the TV for the late news. I had the chance, by chance, I fall into the movie American Sniper, a Hollywood version of a life story of Chris Kyle, the most successful, which means most lethal, US Navy SEAL sniper, according to the US Department of Defense. I didn't want to see the movie, but then what kept me looking was the construction of the bad and the evil as justification of his actions. However, finally I had to procrastinate the reflection about construction, justification, and the web discursive relationships, and simply went to sleep. But my concern remains by being convinced that wherever we live, in whatever circumstances we act, we share responsibility. It has long since become clear, and not only as a result of the dramatic developments in the Near East, that you must not only realize that we are living in a world for which we all bear responsibility, but also that this realization must be followed on the large scale and on the small scale by adequate actions. To quote Hannah Arendt, freedom is only peculiar to man. It is an aptitude that can also manifest itself in other activities than the political ones. But that creates the appropriate reality only through actions. And as a fundament of these actions, the ability to cooperate, to refer to Richard Sennett, is described as one of the most essential and necessary abilities one can possess, virtually as a craft that will determine our future, to cooperate. At a time of great uncertainty, in an unresolved contest of forces, collective endeavor, new collaborative, transdisciplinary and transcultural practices could open up a space for forms of knowledge that could break the hold of conventions, cognitive, political and social. In view of that, now to come to the more institutional side, in view of that, a university must itself set the task of opening up its institutional structures, breaking its institutional routines, and by transcending institutional borders, enabling new synergies to be tapped. In concrete terms, this requires, through modification of familiar frameworks, rules, and habits, making room for the unforeseeable and creating the conditions necessary for experimentation in cooperative and collaborative processes, conditions for learning and investigation, in order to make it possible to redefine the space in which we act and coexist. However, this also means constantly subjecting the group and the collective's modus operandi to self-criticism. And also developing a mode of thought characterized by intersection, a transversal practice. On that transect existing axes and definitions that breaks up the binary forms of logic and the binary structures that legitimate inequality and social exclusion. A kind of network thinking is also needed, a way of thinking in terms of difference that recognizes ambivalence, contradiction and contraries without immediately seeking to iron them out. A mode of thinking that does not require forced disambiguation and the multi-layered and the complex. And the project carried out by Baerbel Mueller in the format of the AFA Labs, I am able to recognize all the above-mentioned fundamental characteristics of a contemporary practice that self-critically demands accountability and is able to consider from different perspectives the conditions, the network of interrelationships in which it is embedded, as well as the consequences that these imply. These characteristics are inscribed in the projects themselves. They constitute their foundation. They remain a reliable frame of reference, even in working conditions that are sometimes very, very difficult. And last but not least, these projects give life to an aspiration of an art university today that sees at its mission contributing to social development and to the identification of problems to be addressed. So thank you again, Baerbel, and all other partners who worked on that project. And I would like to end my welcome by bringing you back to Syria. And I want to let you know that we had a very, very, for us, important exhibition that you, Isin, were the curator of. And I want to end with a short text of Ebru Kurbak. She was related at that time as a researcher to our university. The headline of the text is Lonely the Planet. And there she describes the situation in Syria. She is herself is of Turkish origin. And she writes, 5 years was the exact amount of time needed to transform the image of Syria in our minds from being one of the most peaceful exotic travel destinations to one of the most dangerous places on the planet. From the land of camels, lanterns, and spices to the land of war. 5 years of war was enough to bring a 2,000-year-old ancient city close to being wiped off the map. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Millions of people went from watching the Arab Spring on the TV to leaving their homes behind for a dangerous journey. It all happened only 5 years ago. That part of the planet has been lonelier than others. Some of those people who were once praised for their tremendous hospitality and quick smile have managed to make it until our doorsteps. They are the sole eyewitness to what has been destroyed, but also the rare treasure that has survived. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very interesting afternoon.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I warmly welcome you, the audience, and I also am delighted to welcome the four of you, Alessandro Petti, Romola Sanyal, Mario Rizzi, and our moderator, Isin Önol. Thank you for being here today. I want to briefly introduce you to the background of both the symposium and the exhibition, Structures of Displacement, and I need to start from introducing the Applied Foreign Affairs Lab. So AFAR is a lab at this institute which I founded in 2011, And AFA investigates spatial, infrastructural, environmental and cultural phenomena in sub-Saharan Africa and of latest in the Middle East. Projects are based on a truly interdisciplinary, transcultural and experimental approach. Some projects are conceptualized as pure artistic research, others are based on a design task or commission and most combine both. Thereby mappings, rural growth patterns, urban prototypes, imaginary art spaces and relational physical interventions are produced. Conditions of uncertainty and fragility are embraced, and at best, spatial and programmatic hybrids of diverse ownership emerge. From an initial concentration on a pure interest in rural and urban sub-Saharan Africa within carefully selected project settings, over the years, AFA's emphasis has shifted towards developing specific research methods, alternative project strategies, and decolonizing objectives within this very context. Who tells whose stories, who builds whose buildings, how to enter a space which is not yours, how to connect, how to break stereotypes, how to create shared spaces professionally. There's only a very fine line between listening and learning through mapping and making and imposed and patronizing intervention. Therefore, the process of researching, relating, and creating must be much more about questioning than stating, especially for us operating in the architectural field. The appropriateness, impact, and sustainability of a project are strongly dependent on the joint forces behind it. Thereby, each collaboration is of a very different nature, and its parameters need to be set anew each time. For many reasons, AFA mostly collaborates with artists, cultural collectives, or art institutions. I heavily question common notions of development from a Western perspective in non-Western settings. Therefore, AFA avoids working in this field and the NGO sector. Then, back in 2016, the invitation and opportunity emerged to collaborate with a UN organization, the UNIDO in northern Iraq. UNIDO's project mission was titled Resilience Building Through Immediate Livelihood and Income Generation for Internally Displaced People and Refugees in the northern and Kurdistan region of Iraq. At this point, it was a very open brief with lots of potential to conceptualize a project from scratch, including a programmatic proposal and a selection of a site. Obviously, for us as architects, the brief was strongly connected to the topic of and discourse around camps on a planning and architectural scale, but also in regards to the sociality of this kind of extreme emergency settlement typology. In previous projects, AFA tried to create a discourse around the notions of center and periphery, inside and outside, formal and informal, permanent and temporary, questioning the duality of these and emphasizing on the in-between on all levels. Of course, all these topics arise in the context of camps as a spatial manifestation and questionable consequence of displacement with all its painful implications. I will not talk in detail about the processes and projects which evolved from these interests and the collaboration with UNIDO, which you see in this room in a fragmented and embedded manner that would need a full lecture. Frida will shortly talk about the concept behind this exhibition in a minute. Rather, I would like to emphasize on the need of a wider discourse around these topics now. That is the very reason for this symposium today, and why we invited carefully selected guests who all position themselves from different directions with very strong, specific and also radical approaches towards the issues at stake. Thank you again for being here today.
There is an important silence to be kept. We, setting up this exhibition and symposium, do not know of the pain of being displaced, nor the trauma of being a survivor of a war or an open prosecution. We do not know the futurelessness of living in a camp. So, it is with humbleness that we are reflecting upon these matters that are, as Hannah Arendt aptly called them, crimes against humanity. The number of displaced people in the world is shocking and is steadily rising. The UN has reported that there are 70.8 million displaced people in the world in 2018, and in Iraq alone 1.8 million people. In our currently globalized world, it would be naive and irresponsible to disregard the interdependence of global politics. Europe has insisted on the formulation of the refugee crisis as a situation affecting the richest continent in the world. Figures show that the vast majority of refugees and IDPs in the world are hosted by neighboring countries and the countries facing conflict themselves. Forced displacement describes itself in a set of complex social, economic, geographical, legal and cultural variables. It is impossible to try to reflect upon this global humanitarian phenomenon without assessing the structures that enable it. A structure is defined as an arrangement of interrelated elements, a specific composition that enables either a physical or a social form. We ask ourselves, what is the architectural social structure of human displacement? Which particular composition of elements sets the ground for its intrinsically emergent properties? Zooming out from this project, the Agricultural Training Center in Harsham camp in Erbil, we zoom out to a global discourse. Structures of displacement questions the roles of mapping, planning, architecture, and spatial manifestations within such context, being conscious of the fact that designing solutions could further the problematic. We want to reflect on, share, and discuss the potentials and limits of such challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for hosting us here today. Thank you for these very significant, very important introductions you did, that you have already opened, each of you, already meaningful questions. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today, and I would like to thank to our distinguished speakers today for being with us. The discussion today is especially and unfortunately timely, because only within the last few weeks events, unfortunately, there has been more than 500 people died in northern Syria, mainly Kurdish population, because of the attacks by the Turkish forces, and around 300,000 people have been displaced, according to UNHCR. Structures of displacement depart from the Harsham camp in Erbil, but opens up greater questions about the physical, mental, metaphorical structures of the idea of a refugee camp and its conditions of coexistence for a temporarily generated community consisting of forcibly displaced human beings. When one seeks refuge, the act of acceptance is indeed different than the common act of hosting. Perhaps we would like to think of this relationship between a host and a guest as a metaphor, not only because of positive connotations related to it, but also because what it might remind us. A host is always kind to a nicely behaving guest, but also hopes that the guest is visiting for a limited amount of time. A guest usually comes with a gift and leaves with an invitation to a reciprocal visit. But what happens when this guest is running away from their burning home in urgency, leaving missing lives behind, carrying traumatic memories with them? Not only at home, but throughout the journey, witnesses various forms of human atrocities and abuse. In the contemporary discourse on exile, flight and asylum, a particular controversy and dilemma has emerged around the notion of hospitality. On the one hand, the right to asylum is seen by many as an indispensable component of human rights, which in turn they see as the very foundation and essence of their collective self. What is more, many people share the core social value of hospitality and insist to welcome the guest unconditionally without expecting direct or even delayed reciprocity, even when helping the other in need. On the other hand, the fear of losing power, prosperity, and eventually the own cultural identity as a consequence of immigration has a strong impact on our democratic choices. There may be sufficient wealth to ensure peaceful lives for the current voters, but is there enough to share with the new coming other? Can our values and social contracts survive the arrival and the duration of the stay of the guest? Asks the suspicious and scared portion of the society. What are the conditions of hosting? How are the power relationships and rules set? Can we then talk about conditional and unconditional forms of hospitality? How can we reconsider our position as the host? We see in the exhibition that there were a number of similar questions were asked and various effective responses have been proposed. In this small symposium, at first, Romola Sanyal will be talking about the politics of aesthetics of humanitarian shelter, and she will compare and contrast the focus on refugee camps with displacement into urban areas. Sanyal analyzes recent developments in humanitarianism that have also begun to create urban imaginations of refuge and draws these together to critically interrogate what it means to talk about architectures of displacement. She will be asking questions that are also dealing with the image of the refugee camps that I won't be counting now on that one. So Dr. Romola Sanyal is an associate professor of urban geography at the London School of Economics. She studies architecture, urban geopolitics, urban theory, housing, and citizenship rights. She has written on the politics of space in refugee settlements in the global south with a particular focus on Lebanon and India. Her current work focuses on the politics of policymaking and the emergence of a global humanitarian urbanism. After that, we will hear Alessandro Petti from the architectural collective DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency, founded together with Sandy Hilal. We'll be talking about permanent temporariness that has the same title with his very informative and insightful book. As the title reveals the subject clearly, he will be focusing on the dilemma of the permanence temporality in the context of refugee camps, also discussing the notion of hospitality and power relationships among the 14 concepts they developed in this enriching book. So DAAR, Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency, is an architectural collective that combines conceptual speculations and pragmatic spatial interventions, discourse and collective learning. The artistic research of Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti are situated between politics, architecture, art and pedagogy. In their practice, art exhibitions are both sites of display and sites of action that will spill over into other contexts, build architectural structures, the shaping of critical learning environments, interventions that challenge dominant collective narratives, and production of the political imaginations, the formation of civic spaces, and redefinition of concepts. In his talk, titled Scattered Homes and Raising Walls, Mario Rizzi will depart from his very powerful images of Yazidi camps and bring in personal experiences of practically residing in a number of refugee camps in the past years during the process of his artistic production and number of works. An Italian artist and filmmaker based in Berlin, Rizzi mainly concentrates on the Middle East, questions the notion of border in terms of identity and belonging, while focusing on social outsiders, their individual stories, often forgotten and untold, as well as the traces left in collective memories. We will have the screening of his film, Al Intihar, tomorrow, if you come and join here at 4 p.m. And we will have an extensive talk about his film trio, Bite, as continuation of today's conversation. Before handing the talk to our speakers, I also would like to quote a short part from Hamid Dabashi's beautifully written text on Mario Rizzi in this recent book called Bare Lives, on his work. Over the years, Mario Rizzi has emerged as a visual chronicler of hope and despair, tears and terrors, fears and trembling of our humanity in the sprawling refugee camps that have become definitive to the very texture of our brutalized urbanity. His photography of the Yazidi camp for the internally displaced people in Iraqi Kurdistan caps a career in documenting human suffering beyond words. He captures truth with his camera that we cannot reach with our words. But can we look his picture with impunity? So once again, we will be between the presentations discussing. Also, I would like to welcome our other participants, our discussants, to join the discussions immediately after the presentations when your questions are hot. So please pose your questions immediately. But at the end of the conversation, at the end of the presentations, we will also have a conversation. We will be having a panel discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here today, and for the organizers for putting together such an amazing event. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that will take place today. I'm going to talk today about architectures of displacement and the aesthetics and politics of humanitarian shelter. I come to this discussion as a geographer, as someone who had once done a PhD in architecture, so I attempt to sort of bridge the discussions between different disciplines in my presentation. So I begin by sort of talking about the idea of refugee, the term refugee, which conjures up myriad images, long lines of people with meager possessions on their backs, people held behind fences and barriers in detention centers, caught in the process of departing. On the flip side of these images of hypermobility are images of refugee camps of containment, replete with their blue and white UNHCR tents in row after orderly row. These camps often appear to be located in rural, often barren areas, uninhabited lands. Camps have become the shorthand for refuge, particularly for those thousands fleeing violence in countries in the global south. Academic and popular scholarship have also lent themselves to the production of such normalized images of refuge. Considerable scholarship across different disciplines have engaged with the understanding and debating of the camp, its spatiality, politics, the ways in which it forms subjects. Popular articles have referred to camps as exigent cities, as emergency urbanism, highlighting the vast numbers of people that come to inhabit these spaces and the length of time they spend in them. So today I will mention a brief history of camps and talk about some of the ways in which these images of camps have come to symbolize displacement and refuge, and why they continue to persist in a time when more and more refugees are moving into urban areas rather than camps, and what kinds of spaces are overlooked but are emerging as spaces of refuge. And while I recognize that various kinds of refugee shelters have emerged within the global north, I largely discuss the question of refugee camps in relation to the global south, as this is where I've done most of my work, and also because this is part of the world in which the vast majority of displaced people are warehoused in different ways. So I will talk about the aid, artistic, and academic work in this presentation, and for the purposes of time, my comments remain brief, but I am happy to discuss this in detail during question and answer. In June 2008, the New York Times Magazine ran an article titled "The Exigent City" by Jim Lewis. In it, the article swept through a number of different issues, from permanent temporariness of refugee camps and its vast inhabitants, to the politics of temporality associated with the built environment of the camp and the lack of architectural and design engagement with these spaces of refuge. Much has changed in the last 11 years since the article was published, yet much has remained the same. Refugee camps continue to proliferate across the globe, despite the fact that more and more refugees are moving into urban areas. Camps continue to be seen as temporary spaces with temporary structures, even though we know that protracted displacement has become a norm rather than an exception now, and camps continue to dominate popular, academic, and artistic imaginations as designated spaces for refugees. This should be unsurprising, as camps emerged as temporary technologies of containment and discipline, and this temporal logic continues to permeate its functions. Designed largely in the aftermath of the Second World War, in response to the displacement of refugees in Europe, camps were emplaced as standardized, generalized technologies of power at the end of the war. Displaced persons camps, as they were historically known, allowed the orderly repatriation of people, their screening, quarantine, and allowed for the creation of an entire bureaucracy of administrators, functionaries, doctors, and the like. The literature on World War II camps show the ways in which spatial isolation and the management of refugees and displaced persons and practices related to them were ad hoc-ish and in a constant state of improvisation. Lisa Malky notes that not only were former concentration camps sometimes used as assembly centers for refugees when the war ended, but the architecture of concentration camps made them particularly suitable for the control of masses of people and for the prevention of epidemics and the administration of quarantines. The camp model emerging out of the ashes of the Second World War has evolved, but it has also circulated through the world. Alongside it, UNHCR, which is responsible for refugee protection, together with a range of NGOs, manage these spaces and ensure that inhabitants are cared for in line with certain basic humanitarian standards and are provided with basic supplies in necessary spaces. The UN and allied organizations register refugees, conduct health screenings, provide documentation, calculate approximate populations in order to ensure that correct and cost-effective amounts of aid and services can be delivered. Camps themselves continue to be laid out in a manner that enables efficient delivery of goods and services and the disciplining of and control of inhabitants. In the Sphere Handbook, alongside various other works, there are examples of ideal camp layouts as well as instructions on how to receive and register people. Popular discussions around refugees, particularly in news outlets, continue to focus on refugee camps as sites of misery and limbo in what Lily Chuliaraki calls the spectatorship of suffering. Camps have become the shorthand for refuge, suffering and protracted displacement and exile. UNHCR white and blue tents that are part of a larger humanitarian apparatus of control and care can also be seen as ushering in a new architectural aesthetic of refuge. Artistic attempts at trying to capture the essence of exile, dispossession, and the peculiar permanent temporality of refugees continue to predominantly focus on camps. So if we look at some of the exhibits, Médecins Sans Frontières famously ran a refugee camp in the heart of a city installation in which people tried to understand the organization's aim was to try to get people to understand the main struggles of millions of people who are displaced and to showcase the work of MSF itself. At a smaller scale, various exhibitions have also taken place probing the specificities of camps and their spatialities. In addition to this one, a recent one that I had attended in London in 2017 was titled Spaces of Refuge, and attempted to showcase and share spatial knowledge about refuge. These are just a few examples of undoubtedly larger numbers of exhibits that take place around these issues, and each attempts to demonstrate specific concerns about camps to larger audiences using artistic means. Academic work has also lent itself to the development of the camp as a site of refugee inhabitation. And this is just a small selection of the different kinds of books that have been written on this topic. From anthropologists to geographers, sociologists, migration scholars, and others, there is a disproportionate focus on refugee camps as key sites in which to study refugees, their politics, humanitarian aid, and so forth. Much of the scholarship draws on the work of philosophers such as Agamben, who argue that camps are spaces of exception and refugees are bare life. Scholars working on camps and refugees more generally have both worked with these ideas and challenged them. And I fall into this category of scholars who've tried to develop urban conversations around camps and have also become entangled in Agambenian discussions from time to time. The implications of using the camp as a shorthand for refuge, particularly in the Global South, are manifold. Most problematically, it overlooks the other kinds of refuge that perhaps are more commonplace in many countries, and the challenges associated with these spaces that are unofficial, often seen as illegal, and are governed differently. These include self-settlements that refugees themselves create. These, as Oliver Bakewell amongst others have noted, lie outside of official camps and do not benefit from their support, although sometimes, if their inhabitants are registered, can avail of services in the camps. Those who choose to self-settle may forego the aid and safety net of the camp, but self-settlement may provide livelihood opportunities that may not be available in camp spaces. There's a need then to recognize the flexibility between camp spaces and spaces outside as people move between the two, and to rethink spaces that emerge in between. Many such self-settlements can be seen to occupy gray spaces, as they're neither formal nor informal and benefit neither from the support by humanitarians nor by local governments. Among self-settled populations, urban populations are the largest. As UNHCR itself has finally noted, almost a decade ago now, urban refugees constitute over half the world's refugee population and growing, and there's a need to address them more robustly. Among scholars, there's a move to engage with urban refugees, and these have included studying livelihood opportunities, the exploitation of refugees, social networks, urban informality, mobilities across urban space, the policing and controlling of refugees, and the politics of hospitality around the ideas of city as sanctuary. Spatial and architectural analyses of refugees in cities continue to be extremely limited. In my own work, for example, and I've been doing work both in the Middle East and South Asia, I looked at what it means to talk about an architecture of displacement. And the work that I was doing was on refugee colonies in India that emerged in the aftermath of the partition of India and Pakistan, and the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And one of the things that I was arguing in my work was that we can't, in fact, talk about an architecture of displacement because identity politics shape and reconfigure refugee spaces so profoundly and imbue them with a sense of identity that we can, in fact, study the politics of refugees by studying the ways in which they build their spaces. And we can come to see the diversity of the different kinds of spaces that they inhabit as well. Even today, there's very little attention that is paid to the kinds of experiments that are taking place around shelter for urban refugees. And I'll mention one, it is emerging, and I'll mention one example of this kind of work. So Renee Khrushchev, for example, has discussed different forms of housing for refugees in Europe which range from container housing to the division of hangars and larger halls into smaller segments using walls and tent structures, and the creation of tempo homes, which are effectively prefabricated modular structures, and centers in former military bases or hospitals in countries such as Greece, Germany, and Denmark. And yet, as Irid Katz notes, this signals more than anything else the re-emergence of camp infrastructure in Europe. Other kinds of interventions are also being thought of by humanitarian agencies, and there are different kinds of experiments that are taking place in different parts of the world. And these include renting out private accommodation in both countries such as Greece, as well as non-European countries such as Lebanon. So in the latter case, NGOs have been involved in accommodation for refugees and have attempted to incentivize landlords to rent out apartments to refugees for a specified period of time, either 6 months or a year, either for either rent-free or for a limited amount of rent. And they also incentivize landlords by upgrading their houses. And these are some of the examples of the shelter upgrading projects that have been undertaken by the Norwegian Refugee Council in Lebanon. One could argue, by looking at some of these examples, that what we see is the emergence of a new kind of humanitarian architecture in urban areas. And we can see the new emergence of new kinds of urban spaces. Now, as I have noted earlier, that there's myriad issues faced by refugees in non-camp settings, and these are manifold and complex, particularly as refugees live in informal, often unsanctioned spaces and are often subject to various kinds of harassment and exploitation, and there's an emerging literature on this as well. Tensions between refugees and non-refugees also ignite around access to services and goods that may be limited outside of camp settings. Yet non-camp refugees continue to be largely overlooked in favor of studies and policy work in camps. I would argue that they remain hidden, and their spaces remain missing in our analyses of displacement. In a recent field trip to Lebanon, I asked a UN officer why they were focusing their program so much on the informal tented settlements when clearly the crisis was an urban one. The response I got skirted the question of urban refugees, and instead the person responded, "It's not that the settlements don't have problems." I agree with this position that settlements and camps do have problems, and we should continue to engage meaningfully with them rather than ignore them altogether in favor of other geographies of displacement. But here I'm more interested in why camps continue to be the primary sites of intervention, analysis, and portrayal. What work does the camp do? Now, I'm still working through this question, and Isin was generous enough to tell me that I could make this a slightly more experimental talk, so these are just thoughts on some of these questions. If I return to the discussion that I had with the UN officer, a picture emerges about the utility of the camp. As Richard Black, amongst other scholars, have noted, the camp is discussed as a convenient technology of delivering aid and support effectively to populations that need them. Such narratives hide the larger issues of controlling and sequestering populations. I would take that further and say that it also masks questions of bigger points about how these camps make certain populations visible, mappable, knowable to different actors. It makes the spectatorship of displacement and suffering possible. Aid agencies, humanitarian NGOs, and donors can, for example, see a distinct population of people in need of specific kinds of help and support living in the camp. Host governments and populations can also see displaced people who may cause problems and tensions safely penned into a designated space in which they are treated as humanitarian subjects. Academics, artists, reporters, and writers can enter into and view these distinct and unique spaces and discuss their specificities, their unique forms, and political practices. Camps then become spaces where the spectatorship of suffering is possible. Such practices are less possible to do in non-camp settings, particularly in urban environments, for a variety of reasons. Firstly, as refugees become dispersed through urban environments, it's difficult to quote-unquote find them and document where they are and how they're living. Secondly, the uniqueness of refugees in urban environments tends to melt away, particularly in informal settlements, and many people tend to use a pejorative shorthand of slums when talking about informal settlements, where large numbers of refugees tend to find shelter. Urban scholars have already talked about how slums have become a shorthand for urbanization in the Global South because urbanization in the Global South is seen as dystopian, informal, unplanned, chaotic, and marked by poverty. Slums have also become the sites of aestheticization of poverty. So refugees rub up against the urban poor in these spaces, sharing with them the problems of poverty, lack of access to resources, and second-class citizenship. Elsewhere, I, amongst others, have critically engaged with these comparisons between refugees and the urban poor, attempting to break down these superficial barriers between them. When refugees and the urban poor share the same material spaces, it becomes difficult to create a distinct refugee population and a distinct refugee space within urban areas. It becomes hard to shape it into an image of a unique kind of suffering and trauma, and it becomes challenging to sell it as a specific problem that has to be resolved. And here I'm drawing on Monica Krause's work on the Good Project, in which she talks about how agencies, particularly aid agencies, have to sell projects to donors. And this includes making projects easy enough to do. Thus, projects and beneficiaries in her analysis become commodities. Helping non-camp refugees is not an easy sell. It's often difficult to convince donors to support those in urban environments, for example, especially when that help entails helping the urban poor. And I'm happy to discuss this during the Q&A. And it's also difficult to sell a project where the uniqueness of subject populations and spaces cannot be established. So NGOs often doing urban interventions have a difficult time. Drawing this together with the reluctance that most governments have about having refugees in urban areas, and many pursue punitive measures against what they consider these kinds of transgressions. It is perhaps unsurprising then that non-camp refugees are largely erased from the images of displacement. Camps have played an important role in defining the life and habitation of refugees, and while the focus on them is important, especially as they reincarnate into Europe, it is important to consider what we overlook when we construct an iconography of refuge through its camps. And perhaps it's time that we rethink what architectures of refuge can be and how we can be part of a progressive conversation that pays attention to the wider spectrum of spaces that refugees and other displaced people come to inhabit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful and inspiring talk, Romola. Are there immediate comments or questions already from the audience or from the discussants? Or shall we continue and have the Q&A at the end? Any comments? Alessandro, Mario, already? Then would you like to continue, Alessandro, with your presentation? Thank you.
Still have some energy. If you don't mind, yes, because otherwise I cannot see you, I'm pretty short. I would like just maybe to think about my presentation, just to try to build up from the previous one. That was in fact asking about, when we say camp, what is the image that is in our mind? And most likely, in fact, if you see the same image that I see, I just want to check. Yes, most likely you might, most of the people have this image in mind. which is an assemblage of tent, very fragile and ready to be dismantled. This is the Hesha refugee camp in 1953, which is a camp close to Bethlehem, which is the camp from which what I'm going to say was part of our research, life, and learning environment. This is the Hesha today. So the difficult question to ask is what happened between this image and this one? And I can tell you, no one dared to ask these questions, because first, from the point of view of states and humanitarian agency, this means that it undermines the idea that the camp is a temporary space. It's also a question that refugees themselves don't want to ask to themselves, because this means that they are not going back tomorrow to the place of origin. So it's a very tough question, and this is one of the questions that starts some of the work that we have been doing since years in Palestine, trying exactly to investigate why refugee camps don't have any history. And as has been already said, we are more and more producing camps, more and more somehow the age of these camps, become bigger and bigger. Now it's about between 2 and 3 decades old. In the case of refugee camp, of the Hesha refugee camp that was built in 1949, the paradox is even technically some of the structures that exist today in the refugee camp, for the Palestinian architectural law of preservation, they need to be preserved because they are historical buildings. So, and that somehow brought out the conversations, with the refugee community in the Hesha, with the Popular Committee and the several different organizations. The Hesha is I cannot tell the whole story of this camp, but has specific also history among the Palestinian camps. If a camp in itself is a special extraterritorial site, the Hesha is among the special of the special in some ways. But then also maybe to try to go back why we are somehow stuck with the camp, because the camp create an extreme situations. The camp is in that sense a limit situations that allowed us to understand so many other things. And during my short presentation, I would like to go back to that, because it's important that we don't understand the camp as something that is there. Because what is happening at the camp, the experiment of the camp, is actually influence your very normal life. And that is the condition of permanent temporariness, where somehow try to capture that feeling of precarity, that feeling that is similar. Of course, one cannot compare in terms of intensity, but the sense of precariousness that, for example, young people, in Greece or in Italy or in south in Spain, are experiencing in terms of, living in one apartment and then not knowing if they can stay longer. What does that kind of feeling do, in terms of engagement in the present reality? There's this sense of postponement, right? I'm always in constant movement. I'm always precarious in this situation. So in our work, and more recently, especially when we moved out from Palestine, it became important also for us to make these connections in order not to think about the refugee crisis as something that, first of all, it will be fixed one day or another, maybe, and then all the rest, will work, and that is, in the normality. I also trying to understand our normality as something which is not normal, because it's all invested in the ways in which you understand things from the camp. So in that sense, for me, the camp still remains an interesting site, simply because it's more extreme, simply because it makes things more clear. And one was thinking before, in a way, your questions about why we are insisting on the camp, in some ways, for me, has the same parallel when Israel started to build the wall in Palestine, and people were shocked, and suddenly, how come, the wall? And this was already, let's say, the system of control and separation has been already in place. Building the wall that, by the way, is not finished, it is just a physical manifestation. In that sense, it's actually an architectural object. They somehow catalyze both images, politics on one side, and suddenly people say, my God, they really have a terrible regime there. I had this Israeli friend, that suddenly had some courage, from Tel Aviv. He drove, and I went to pick him at the checkpoint, and then he suddenly was facing the wall. I said, my God, we are really terrible people. So in some ways, what this situation actually do, it makes evident something that was already there. I mean, Israel was no reason for Israel to build the wall. There is no, also just to know that this is not finished. The same reason why Trump wants to build the wall. Do you think that this would ever, really be an instrument to separate Mexico from, that is, of course, has nothing to do with the effectiveness. What is effective is the fact that I'm doing that. This is my politics. This is the politics of separation. This is the image. So this is why it's important also to always refrain between the production of images and the actual reality of this site. But to go back to our camp, and that was the question somehow. So now, this was the Hesha in 1953. Goes back, yes. And this is another image from the 60s, and this is the image of today. It's exactly the same point of view. And here, as an architect, you can ask questions, what is this? Is this a camp? Is it still a camp? Some people say, no, it's not a camp anymore. It's a city. And that's also referred to the urbanity of many of these places. But it's not a city. Why? Because in this place there is no municipality. There is no idea of public and private. Refugees that build these cities, they cannot legally own their homes. There might be 3, 4 floors buildings, but legally they cannot own it because the land is leased from either a private owner or a state, and therefore they live in this situation which everyone knows, of course, this is the house of that person, but legally they cannot actually own it. At the same time, the space in between the homes, which usually people live in the city called the public, is not public. Because again, there is no municipality, there is no organization that takes care. Even UNRWA, in this case the United Nations that somehow is in charge for assisting the refugees, always says, we are not managing the camp. We are assisting refugees wherever they are, in the camp, outside the camp. We are just assisting refugees. We are not managing the camp. They don't feel they are in charge. Now, here I would like to talk more about different projects that we have been doing in the last, now, more than 2 decades in refugee camps, university that we established, and looking at the camp as a site of knowledge production. But here, maybe, since I have already passed my first 10 minutes, I can just briefly show you some of the interventions, because for us also, we are not social scientists. I have this damnation of being an architect. And architects somehow are constantly called in intervening in the situation, not just studying it. We are not just happy to just criticize. We also want to engage in the situation that we are interested in. So, going back to these specific questions about, do refugee camps have a history? We started now, maybe 3 years ago, as a provocation to say, what if we considered the Hesha refugee camp as a World Heritage Site? And we took this very seriously. So we went to the UNESCO website, we download the Annex 5, which is where all the UNESCO criteria, you have to respond and you have to legitimize, you have to explain why you are nominating that site as a World Heritage Site. Of course, I'm skipping all one important and fundamental parts, that the whole attempt is not to be recognized by UNESCO, right? We know that UNESCO itself, was established with the universalistic idea of heritage that comes from a specific Western imperial and colonial understanding of what constitutes heritage, right? So I just gave an assumption that most of us will agree that this is still the colonial apparatus of the West deciding what constitutes heritage. But nevertheless, as we do it with colonial buildings, we say we want to re-inhabit that very structure and to see if it can handle what is a camp, if it can handle the values that are emerging from the camp. So here I just just show you some of this material. This is a book that is in process to be written, and this is a collective book, because it's a book that is continually presented among refugee communities, experts, during Documenta last time in Kassel. So it's constantly somehow up to date. The idea, in fact, that we don't want to get somewhere. And as I said, maybe the ultimate goal, is not necessary to have that site recognized, but actually to pose these questions. And then if someone else, if the refugee community themselves wants to do it, they can do it. But this is not necessarily our goal, because this for us would mean that we have submitted to the UNESCO understanding of what constitutes heritage. But as I said, nevertheless, we don't leave them alone, because we want to challenge also what we consider heritage. Who can define what constitutes heritage? Why the Haitian refugee camp is not heritage, despite it had such an important role in the history of Palestine, I would say, of the world, of displacement, because Palestinians are the oldest displaced refugee community in the world. Here, I don't know if you see them, but there are some graphics.
You can stay there if you like.
It's okay, I can do it. Very quickly, 20 minutes. So, here we investigate some houses. This is the house of Isar, that was one participant that is alive. One participant of Campus in Camps, which is a university that we established in a refugee camp, and we started to work on his house and collect all the history of how it evolved from the tent that you see there to the shelters. So after a few years, imagine what kind of dramatic architectural discussion people had to have, at that time. During they remember, especially it was in the 54, a very cold winter. And at that point, people might have realized that they might stay in that site. You have to imagine that people were there, and most of the villages, I will show you later on, they are just a few kilometers away from the Haitian. So if they walk for 3 hours, they go back home. And this happened in 1949, and until today, they are not allowed to go back home. Imagine what kind of political situations we live in to be considered normal. People can just go home by walking. They are not allowed to do that. So UNRWA stepped in, built these shelters. These shelters, what I was saying, actually for the Palestinian law should be heritage sites. They were built in the 50s. We are in 2019. So for the Palestinian law, they are actually already heritage. So the story continues. In 1967, Israel also entered the West Bank, another displacement, people leave the camp, so Isar family take over some of the older shelters and start to connect them. And connected them and building. And the house that you see now was built essentially, in fact, by most of the camp. I mean, the max expansion of the camp was during the 90s. It was the time in which most of the men were imprisoned, was the First Intifada, and then after, during the peace process where people were still in prisons. And in fact, most of the architects of this structure of displacement were women. So we were recollecting all these very difficult decisions they had to make in order, to negotiate the idea that you want to go back to the place of origin, but at the same time, you want to have a life in dignity in a place where you live. And that was, for example, for us as architects, what makes me also wanting to come back to be an architect. Because architecture in a camp, everything has a political dimension. And the moment that, for example, they had to negotiate if they have to change the roof that was used as a zinco roof, they had to protect themselves, that was a discussion about architecture, but with incredible political meanings. And that was for me, for example, what also has a great value, how from the camp you destabilize the notion of heritage. From the camp, you destabilize the notion of what is architecture. So that is also the other way. We have to flip the table. We don't have to normalize the camp. We have to make sure that the life outside gets changed and gets shaped by what actually is happening in these camps. Here I just go quickly because there are other materials that I wanted to show, but I'm already in 15 minutes. Here maybe I just show you this image. Like I don't have time to talk about them. It's important to see the camp at night. How many times you saw a camp at night? It's like an endless day, right? Refugee camps, just it's always day. There is no night in refugee camps. So briefly here I just say that these were images that we commissioned to an Italian photographer, Luca Capuano, that was the photographer of the World Heritage Site that Italy submitted to UNESCO. So, and we asked him to simply take the picture in the Haitian with the same way, the same respect, the same idea of monumentality that he used when he was photographing World Heritage Sites in Italy. The last time in Kassel, we invited a community member from the Haitian, but also we invited Jad Tabet, that was a former UNESCO expert. He was in the commissions deciding. So at that time we were wanting just to nominate the Haitian as a World Heritage Site. And he took the work very seriously, so he responded to our first draft application. And he said, you cannot nominate, or say, I suggest not nominate only the Haitian as a World Heritage Site. But you have to nominate all the 44 villages where the Haitian were expelled from. So there is a continuity between the Haitian and the camps. So then, we went back and we started to have our homework. And here I cannot have time to show you, but hopefully in a year you will see this as a publication. And there is another dimension of this work that is through public debate, to physical intervention in the camp, but also through art installations, also to the importance of using art exhibition as a way in which you bodily experience a certain dimension. In this case is the exhibition at the Van Abbe Museum, and we always dreamed somehow to have in close proximity to walk in the Haitian and to walk in the villages of origin. So for us it was important to use the exhibition as a space in which you finally experience the return. You finally have this idea of confronting the site of displacement and the site of return. So here all these books, there were 44 villages where and people could touch and could go through. But again, if you want to know more about this, all the documentation is already published partially on this website, which is decolonizing.ps. And if I still have, I have 19 minutes. Can I just, So yes, this was one of the discussions that we had with Campus in Camps participants about this paradox of the camp, being temporary, but then being permanent at the same time. And that is, of course, in architecture, is this embodiment of the archetype of the tent that is made of very fragile materials, and the concrete homes that I showed to you before. So in some way we said how to somehow bring this paradox together, and that was the idea of the concrete tent. And at that time we wanted to build a site of gathering for the students of Campus in Camps. And we wanted to have a site in which you walk in and you have these questions in front of you. The question of what is this object that is made by both these elements. It looks temporary because it actually looks like a tent, but you sit in it and you touch it, and then you discover that actually is made of concrete. So somehow the idea of inhabiting these contradictions, not being forced to choose, right? Not to somehow be stuck in temporality, or being forced to normalize your life and become a citizen, which is also another kind of illusions, because we know, and this is the, how the camp then it links to, for example, broader issues about migrations. I don't know how many of you are maybe already living in a place where they were not born, and they already live in a different place that is not theirs. And you know the feeling that, you will never be one of them. You'll never be one of them. So also how to challenge this idea of integration, that means that there is only one way to exist, right? So how we are able to imagine a society in which you don't have to give up your multiplicity of belonging. We live in a very strange time in which we think we are so advanced, but what is imposed on us? That we have to decide one nationality, we have to decide one thing, and this is, of course, is our theological understanding of the present reality. No, we are incapable of thinking that a person can move between different places and belong to all of them at the same time, without wanting to decide which one is better. But we are incapable to imagine a world that actually allowed something like this. I think some of us, they have some more privileged passports that actually can do it, but most of the people, they are not allowed to have that kind of life that is demanded by their very existence. So we are somehow living in this political and spatial structures that are so stuck, into this very old conception. And these are just some images from the concrete tent that we built in the Hisha. Here I can only skip this part. But also it was interesting, as I said, for us, that this is a little bit something new and also scary, I have to say, because that was the place for us that we have knowledge, that we are engaged, we live. But then we started to be engaged in different other sites. This is in Abu Dhabi, and we were really terrified by the idea, what does it mean, to work in a place in which we don't live, we are not engaged in that specific struggle. But the beauty of that project, that in a way was really speaking so differently to the 80% of the people in the Emirates that actually don't have the right to stay. More than 90%. Or
I don't know
more,
precisely, but more than 80%.
Let's say, the vast majority, imagine you have an entire country that lives in a concrete tent. Because the moment they lose the job, they have to leave the country. That is their status. They don't live in a camp. But can you imagine the feeling that you lose your job and then you have to leave the country? Imagine also generation of people actually live there, and now they work all their life, and now they have to retire, and they have no place where to go back to. So what is going to happen to them? And that is where, for example, the experience of the camp, this is at least what we try to do, and what we are trying to do in these very years, is also to bring this radicality of the camp and pose these questions in front of everyone. For us, it was very moving because, for example, also with the students that inhabit the concrete tent, it also become a space of pedagogy. It was the first time they had a public discussion about that. Imagine how crazy it is. Two artists from Palestine had to build a concrete tent in order to have a public discussion about the fact, wait a second, why 90% of the population in the Emirates cannot actually stay? That was, one of the very occasions in which that became like not only something you have to deal with yourself, when you go to bed and have that feeling of precarity, which is also another way to manipulate politics, that we have to solve our problem individually. We are not able to solve them collectively. And this is where I think the camp, paradoxically, after so many years, is actually an interesting place, because if people are staying in a place, they might become a community. And when they become a community, they start to see themselves not only as individual, people that UNRWA will take care, just to feed them. They become political subjects. And if they can become political subjects, states organizations, institutions are in trouble. 25 minutes, and I don't have maybe time to show you this. Yeah, maybe I'll stop here. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessandro. I think Mario will continue with all his comments in his talk, as Alessandro did. So let's continue, and then we have the Q&A at the end.
So I will, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be with you and to talk about this subject today that is very urgent. And I have the privilege of speaking after the others, so I can answer the others. So I decided to, and I speak from a different perspective. I'm not an architect, I'm an artist and filmmaker. And so I speak of a personal and artistic experience. And I decided to put my talk upside down to answer, first of all, an interesting comment that you made, Frida. You were saying that we don't know what it means to be a refugee. So let's first, and there are actually many mistakes and misunderstandings. Also, I noted when you said why when somebody goes in a city is not anymore a refugee. And because there is between refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant, different definition. Okay, but I want to begin from methodology problematics, which is probably for me very important, that I always pose in my work, and that I find very important, so much that I put this text in many of my books. There is an artist, an Australian artist called Tanya Canas, that wrote some years ago, I forgot the year, but I can tell you, in 2015, a text that probably in the text says everything, that is 10 things you need to consider if you're an artist, and I would add here a researcher, not of the refugee and asylum seeker community, looking to work with our community. And there are some points, I will not of course read all the text, but I will read the points. First of all, we are not a resource to feed into your next research project. You may be talented at your particular craft, but do not assume that this automatically translates to an ethical, responsible, and self-determining process. And she defined this point, I cut it short, as process, not product. And second point is to critically interrogate your intention. Our struggle is not an opportunity, on our bodies a currency, by which to build your career. I think that everybody that works with refugee migrants should think about this. And rather than merely focusing on other, where do I find refugees, etc., try to critically reflect on what are the reasons of your analysis. And the third point is realize your own privilege. I don't need to explain more about this and the biases. And the fourth point is that participation is not always progressive or empowering. And this is quite important. Of the points I said until now, probably is the most important. Your project may have elements of participation, but know how this can just as easily be limiting, tokenistic, and conditioning. And then another point that is presentation versus representation. I had this issue, personally, I've been really shocked about this issue. I will tell you now a bit about the work. I have the luck that tomorrow I present more about my work, so today I can more answer the question of the symposium. Anyway, one of the work I did was at the beginning of the establishment of Zaatari camp, the biggest Syrian refugee camp at the border between Jordan and Syria. And I am based in Berlin, and all of a sudden, in all talks about Syrian in Berlin, I began being invited. And okay, the first time, you know, as an artist, sometimes you don't think that's why this is important. And then I began asking, okay, why do you invite me? There is a huge Syrian community in Berlin. They are all graduate. Maybe they have a bigger university title than me, and they have a very clear, why am I representing the Syrian community? And this is quite important. Another point is, it is not a safe space just because you say it is. So this requires long-term grassroots work, solidarity and commitment. Do not expect us to be grateful. We are not your next interesting arts project, or research project maybe. Our community are not sitting waiting for our struggle to be acknowledged by your individual consciousness, nor highlighted through your art practice. Do not reduce us to an issue. Do your research, so know the solidarity work already being done, know the nuanced differences between organization and projects. Just because we may work with the same community doesn't mean we work in the same way. Then there are 2 points, actually I synthesize in one in reality, that is that art is not neutral. Our community has been politicized, and any artwork done with by us is inherently political. If you wish to build with our community, know that your artistic practice cannot be neutral. I cannot speak more, not getting in details on other thing. I had this experience about the not neutrality. Now I got an art prize in Italy that will become a retrospective show. Actually, I hope some of you can visit it in Pecci Museum in Italy from 7th of November until 15th of March, which is called Beit, that in Arabic means house. And we'll have 6 on my films and photographs and so on. And also the slideshow I'm going to present you now. And tell me about the time. I don't have a time here. There was, I asked, Isin mentioned that Professor Dabashi from Columbia University has written about myself. I asked Professor Dabashi to write about my new film that is about a lady, it's called The Little Lantern. It's about an 84 years old, originally Danish lady that in 1961 went, in 1960 she heard for the first time about the struggle of Palestinians and was shocked to know what was happening to Palestinians. She decided to go to Lebanon the years after in 61. And she went first to Damascus, then to Lebanon. Tomorrow you can see some clips from the film, so you're invited to come tomorrow. And she was referred to the main Palestinian writer and journalist about novelists today, together maybe with Darwish and Edward Said, different fields. Maybe he's one of the 3 main, Ghassan Kanafani. And after 2 months, she met him in Beirut. They married. And she never came back to, of course, for holidays, yes, but she never came back to live in Denmark. She decided to stay also during the 15 years of civil war. And when he was killed by the Israeli, in the moment in which the politics of Moshe Dayan was killing the intellectuals in 72, she decided to stay as well and to continue in the way she could. She was a kindergarten teacher by education, so she decided to establish kindergarten that were not covered by UNRWA, by UNRWA, that is the UN organism that is working with the Palestinian refugees. And she established kindergarten in 6 of the refugee camps of Lebanon, and she educated more than 10,000 children. So coming back to the point, I asked Professor Dabashi to write about this. And the comment was, synthesizing in a more nice way, was that, oh, it's quite an insider. It's too much of an insider to write on an art book. And it was, for me, a shocking thing that in the art world I was accused of asking an insider, somebody that writes every day. Professor Dabashi is the one that took the chair of Edward Said at Columbia, the oldest chair of the States. So I guess most of you know who is Edward Said, who did the funeral speech at his funeral. So, and saying that he is such an insider that they were shocked at, for example, the Israeli assassination by of Ghassan Kanafani, why we don't take away Israeli. So first of all, let's try to think about our bias when we deal with this subject. So about refugees, there are different refugees, and one of the interesting things about the camps, of course, before entering, and then I show on this slide. One of the interesting things about the camps, Alessandro was speaking in the most interesting and complete way about the camps in Palestine. The interesting thing about the camps in Palestine, in Lebanon, is that, of course, this is everywhere, that usually nobody thinks about this, somebody owns this land. So this land are on lease, usually to UNHCR. It's a difference with Zaatari camp. That was an urgent situation, so it was in a very unusual situation that's been established. But usually it's on lease to UNHCR. So the lease, because of the international law, cannot be more than 99 years. Otherwise it becomes property. So we all know that the issue of Palestinians started in 1948. I always begin to ask myself what will happen in 2047 of these camps when the lease is finished. Will they do a new lease? And then how it is temporary. So there is something very interesting. There has been, in the last 10 years, 84 new walls, complete walls between states that has been built. It has been calculated. And the only way there has been a wall now that was destroyed by the same country that built it. It's so funny, this interesting thing. So think a country has put a wall to divide from refugee coming, from the issues of refugee, but they had to destroy it themselves. Well, it was Turkey. To invade Syria now, they had to destroy their own wall. I was so shocked to see the images of this. And when we speak of the fact that there are 3,000 new displaced people from the 9th of October, so it's not so many days, there are more than 500 people killed. And we should also think that we are all in peace today, because there is a truce, and in 5 days, whatever the hours is, they should go away from 30 kilometers, leave the 30 kilometers to Turkey, and go away. Okay, think what it means to leave your house because the Turkish army wants to put 3.5 million refugees from their country to this area. And second, think how many new displaced people this will create. So there was a situation that happened already, and it's very similar some way to what happened it was not, strange enough, it's very rare that happened that the fault is not the West. In this case it was not the West. But it's very near to what happened with the states and leaving the Kurdish alone and asking them to take away their fortifications around 2 cities in particular, Afrin and Kobane, and then they leave them alone. Now that you don't have fortification, we leave you in the hands of the Turkish army. The same thing happened on the, you see the date on this house here, on the 3rd of August 2014, to the Yazidi people. And this is a photograph from Iraqi Kurdistan in an internally displaced people camp. So we have also people that are displaced in their own country. This is already also a difference. The Yazidi, because of their religion, that is an Abrahamic original Mesopotamic religion, they have been discriminated. They calculated there were 74 situations of discrimination against them, and that's why they marked the date. On the 3rd of August 2014, the Peshmerga that were protecting the Yazidi decided to leave them in the hands of the Daesh, of the ISIS. And the Toyota of the ISIS invaded the area, killed 5,000 men in 2 days, 5,000, and kidnapped most of the women. And for a ransom, they were given back for a ransom, so was a way to funding the Daesh. And of course, after being subjected to violence. And these are some of the images from this camp in 2016. And these are some of the women, actually. Some of the people, I will not comment because of the time, but I guess, of course, we can talk more if there are questions. And this is a symbol of their religion. And they lead prayers to their God, that is a single God, is a monotheistic religion. So it has element actually of Christianity today because it's a Mesopotamic origin religion, so of Judaism and Islam. And they leave every little piece of fabric you see is a prayer left to their God. And this is a border. It's another situation that was also in 2016, at least I was in 2016. We have exactly the same situation with the same number of people today at the border between Bosnia and Croatia. This was between Macedonia and Greece and Macedonia, and because the way before for the refugees was from Turkey to Greece to Macedonia up. And Macedonia closed because of the request of Germany. They closed their border, and in a city on the track of the train there was a temporary camp. This is another situation. With 15,000, this is the Macedonian army that you see on the other side. Today there is Velika Kladusa and Bijać. They are the same number of people. Here there were 15,000 people. In Velika Kladusa there are 18,000 people at the moment, respecting. And there are in Bijać around 5,000. And as you see, people were temporarily creating. There were Yazidi, of course, also there, as you can see. Actually, this is also the invitation of the exhibition in Italy. And of course, you expect people throwing stones and so on. No, there are different ways of manifesting, more civilized and polite. And here, the EU-Turkey agreement, not in our name, probably speaks by itself. And you see Syrian from DAAR, and the line from the camp. And you see it is really in the train station. And the only way to leave this situation is to communicate with your family. So the phone, and the phone, and the phone, and the tears when you call. This was a very interesting story. I want to have 1 minute to say, because there was a French organization giving this satellite phone. And I always create my own family in every camp, so they were my family. And she said, we can have only 2 minutes to speak. Speak with the guy. If we cannot speak, we can speak more. I couldn't have an exception, but I did a different thing. I started talking with the guy. We talked for 15 minutes, and she could call in the meantime, so, so it was a way to distract his attention. And there are people that, of course, go more in the fields. And there are always NGOs, but as they are unofficial camps, they are usually not UNHCR protected. The fact that human rights don't apply here probably is. And they are happy because they think they reached the goal, but in reality, we should think that this is until we are all free. One last thing, if you give me 1 minute. 1 minute? Yes. Is just to show you, to complement in a different way what was told by Alessandro. There is a different camp also from 48 that is in Lebanon. This is the first camp. Okay, you have Annika Nafani, this lady, speaking over, saying what happened when, and it's quite interesting what Ghassan Kanafani told. There is 1 minute, so we see. And so this is the camp. There are totally different. This is today, eh? Okay, thank you. And about this camp, it's interesting that they cannot still today put beton on the houses because otherwise they become permanent. And they are not allowed. They are all the children, most children, although they are in Beirut, this is Beirut, they have never seen the sea because they live on in the camp. They never go out. And this is quite important. And they never imagine a life out of the camp. So this is quite important also to consider about temporariness and permanency of the camps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. Maybe let's take 10 minutes of break, freshen our minds, and also prepare the questions you might have in your mind. And continue with the discussion for another 50 minutes. I hope you have time to join us. Thank you. So thank you very much once again for the presentations. My head is full of questions and I took pages of notes. I'm sure you also have a lot of questions. Although from very different approaches, the main focus was obviously the notion of temporariness of this permanent situation and the problems with them, and also the notion of responsibility, self-criticality, as Barbara started the conversation with the responsibility of an institution, for example. What does it mean to be in the university setting today and having this institutional responsibility? But also self-criticality was very important, I think. And the second common point was the image of refugee camps. So as a, perhaps even we could call a refugee camp as a spectacle, right? There's something to be looked at also. And it was interesting to see that, or be reminded that we always see these camps in daylight, and there are this certain image, but and then what does it mean to have it in urban spaces, as Romola focused her talk on, and how are the funding agencies and donors function in this case, and what are our understanding of notion of refugee camp in a urban space and in the camp setting, and what happens then, as Alessandro pointed out, when the refugee camp itself becomes a city but does not function as a city because of the lack of self-autonomy, perhaps even. And as Mario pointed out, there is also the notion of internal displacement within the country. So there are always the minorities of minorities that are being most damaged in the process. Not to mention genders, perhaps, right? There is always the other in the situation. So I would like to open 4 questions, perhaps maybe starting from you if you have questions to one another, and then we can open to the audience, because all of your topics were actually, your titles and your approaches were very different, but the focuses were very common, I would say. So, would you like to comment on each other's talks at all? Zero? Do you have any word? Yeah?
Yes, otherwise... Guys, let's act as a group, otherwise... it's not nice. Exactly.
I will punch him for that question later.
No, but maybe it's a general question that also I've been always struggling with, and I also felt it was part of your presentation. So I take this as an opportunity also to ask my own questions through your work. And starting from this specific, of course, acknowledgement that most of the refugees, in fact, they don't live in camps, so they live in different kind of situations, which is per se already an interesting way to somehow refresh the conversations, right? That for many years, for many decades, it is true that was focusing on the camp, and I tried to explain why for me it was still relevant. But my question would be how to avoid, in this, maybe pertinent point of view on urban reality, how to avoid, this quick somehow solution to say, okay, you see, then, ultimately it's not a big problem, they blend into the rest of the cities, and for example, many times from the audience I received this question, what would be the difference between a slum and a camp, and then people would say, yeah, ultimately Palestinian camps are slums, and they can be easily integrated with the rest of the society, there is no problem. So what in this case the political discourse in Palestine has been always, how to refuse normalization, how that for me, for example, remain a sort of red line. If one talks about principles, I always ask myself, is it my work, going towards the normalization of the situation, or I'm somehow producing a knowledge that took back certain rights that the Palestinian community wants to deal with, which is, for example, the right of return, which is, this essential rights that I hope that through the work, one can promote, instead of maybe refocusing the discussion on one side, in this case, don't you see, let's say, how you would avoid the trap of this accusation, or the trap of just at the end of the day say, yes, you know, if they already, some of them are very good example of people that integrate themselves in the urban reality, and therefore, you know, there is no problem, and then everything is solved. And we always, in whatever we do, we are always moving into this, you know, paradoxical situation. So, you know, this I'm not suggesting that we should not research on it, or is not an interesting approach, because I definitely think it's a very pertinent one. But how you would avoid, you know, that kind of happiness that will come from some people that say, okay, that's it, you know. It's true. Majority of the people are already living, you know, in urban areas, so are only this kind of troublemakers that still live in the camp and makes our you know, life difficult. But otherwise, the problem is already solved.
First her and then.
Okay, thank you for that question. I actually think that the issue is exactly the opposite. That people who move into urban areas are seen as troublemakers, not the other way around, because actually countries want to keep refugees in camps, and there's been a larger literature talking about this, about why countries want to put refugees in camps. And, you know, as I said that in my talk, that there's, you know, that some people say, like host governments will say, oh, it's easier to deliver aid or you know, so, you know, help them and what have you, but actually it is about containing refugees. Because many host governments and people who kind of, a lot of migration scholars and refugee scholars have also talked about this, that in a lot of countries in the global south, where countries themselves face developmental issues and questions around governance and provision of resources and services to their own citizens, actually having refugees come into areas and, you know, move into these places actually is much more disruptive. And there's sort of work by people like Lauren Landau, for example, that has talked about some of this. So actually urban refugees is something that people, UNHCR until 2009 had a policy of not discussing urban refugees in any meaningful way, because governments pressured UNHCR not to talk about urban refugees, because they didn't want to talk about urban refugees as even existing. As a policy, it was a geopolitical policy issue to de-recognize or not recognize refugees, because recognizing that urban refugees existed meant that UNHCR would highlight this as a specific problem that then would have donors give money towards it. So I actually think that the issue is quite the other way around. And as a result, and then in addition to that, I think what I would also say is that it is very complex for a lot of organizations to work in urban areas to support humanitarian work, to support refugees, because they cannot simply target refugees, they have to target local populations. And I didn't really talk about this in great detail in the talk, but it's something that donors often don't want to do, because they don't want their money, they want their money to be earmarked specifically for refugees. But what happens when you move into an urban area and you only support refugees and not support the urban poor? You cause tensions between them, and we've seen this in the case of Lebanon, for example. And so they've had to kind of switch into a different mode, and there's all kinds of experiments that are taking place in different contexts, and it is becoming a very complicated situation, which is why I said that a lot of in the work that I'm doing right now, it is with humanitarian organizations to look at the kinds of policies that they're doing. What are they doing in terms of urban interventions? And it is challenging for them. It is difficult for them to sell it to themselves. The idea that they're going to work in urban areas is a difficult sell for many NGOs to their own networks. Like, a lot of NGOs are rather reticent about getting involved in urban areas. And let alone donors. So there's been a very very slow move in this direction, and there's still a lot of slow work around this. So I don't think that this is something that is, and I don't actually think that the aid organizations are doing this as a way of normalizing the situation. I think what they're doing, or at least the narrative here, and it comes from a lot of governments as well, is that, well, if the host communities are supporting these refugees and they are being left out, and there's so much pressure on infrastructure and so forth, then humanitarian organizations should intervene in urban areas and support everybody. So they should be supporting host communities and so forth as well. So it's not a normalizing narrative, it's a supporting narrative. It's kind of, it's sort of like what I've talked about in some of the work that I'm doing right now is a kind of a transitional language. That how do you sort of support people for medium to long term in an urban area? I think in response to some of your other questions, so the work that I did during my PhD is very similar to the work that you did, because the work that I was doing in Lebanon and India, like I should say this out front, I often do this, but I see myself very much as an urban geographer. I study urbanization in the global south. I mean, I look at refugees. I study forced migration as a way of understanding how cities urbanize in the global south, and look at questions of urban poverty and marginalization that different communities face in the global south, and the kinds of governance challenges that come to city authorities, because I also teach as a planner. When I was doing the work in Lebanon and India, I was also asking these questions of how did camps evolve into concrete structures in Lebanon, and how did they become these kinds of, and you showed this in Bursa Barajne, that they become kind of these, some people have talked about them as being kind of like vertical slums, that there are many stories that are built one on top of the other, and there are images that I have from Shatila, from my fieldwork, that have done very precarious structures because the footprint of the actual building is quite small and people are building up. And in contrast to that, the refugee colony... In Shatila, that's why I said that in Shatila they have. And in the refugee colonies that I was studying in India, they became suburbs of the city. I think one of the things that I want that emerged from that work is actually looking at what are the politics at play here by people who are displaced. Do they want to be integrated or do they not? So in the context of the partition of India and the refugees that came from there, we're talking about 13, 15 million people, a large number of them, most of them wanted to be integrated into the Indian context. And they squatted on land and created these colonies that they expected would be authorized by the government. And it was a very specific building tactic to gain recognition and gain citizenship in the country. It's very different to the Palestinian case, because they're also stateless, and there's a political claim to seeing their spaces being distinct. So that's why, for me, it's really important to think about what are the politics at play in the actual act of building, and in actually tracing the ways in which these places evolve. So I think that would be sort of my other point, like sort of response to it, is that if people ask that question, the question to ask back to them is like, well, what is it that people have, in terms of their aspirations going forward?
So there are actually now two questions, because I don't know if to answer first Alessandro or first Romola. We'll start with Romola. There is a substantial point. UNHCR has a clear definition of what is a refugee, what is an asylum seeker, what is a migrant. And a migrant and an asylum seeker can be for a political reason, for economic reason. There are many different, and at least when we speak clearly of what are the definitions, this should be divided. I can make an example, practical. Tomorrow, if somebody comes to see the film, there is the protagonist that was in a camp at the border between Jordan and Syria. In the moment in which now she lives in Amman, in the capital of Jordan, she left the camp, she lost the title, the protection as a refugee. She is now an asylum seeker in Jordan. So when we speak, because of the UNHCR regulation, this is a totally different protection status. And so the main thing is to be clear on the terms, on the terminology, because then they have different rights and different situations. And when we speak then of asylum seekers, if we speak in general, it is the fact that they don't have all the rights. It's true that she was first living in a camp in class, if we speak of the specific case to give an example of the film. But there she was having the things for the baby, to change a baby. She was getting blankets in winter. She was getting some food. Now she lives in a room with 8 people from 3 different family groups in a room in Amman, and she goes to work 10 hours a day as a waitress, and she has 3 kids. So the question is, which rights we give to these people? Is it possible, getting to the question, and speaking first another, because then I can go to the question as a transition. In Lebanon, if we speak of Burj Barajne camp or the other camp, the Palestinians that live there, this is the 4th generation of people that live there from 1948, they can go to university if they have the money, or if they can find the money to go to university. There are even free universities. They are less important. Of course, it's not the American university, but there is a possibility to go to university. The question is that you can even graduate, and there is 47% of people that have an MA. I'm not saying BA, I'm not saying PhD, MA. 47 in Burj Baraj. But the question is that to work in Lebanon, so I'm kind of getting to the answer to you by this. To work in Lebanon, you have to be member of the professional unions. To be member of the professional union, you have to have Lebanese citizenship. Palestinians have not Lebanese citizenship, so they can get a university degree, but they cannot work for the degree they get. So we are speaking again about the rights that we give. And the situation is now that from last government, Hariri, has even taken away the possibility to Palestinians to work in minor works because they are temporary. So before they were kind of working in black, I don't know if it is clear in English, and now they are illegally working in black. Before it was accepted. Now, from the last government, not. I guess you read this. So why I'm saying this about Lebanon is because somebody asked me, and I found this is quite important, but also because I find that the solution, there is a solution. First of all is to give rights. We have examples. When some countries have decided, and I will give you 2 examples also here, to accept refugees with a specific group of refugees. Portugal did, and after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Portugal did it with Ukrainians. They wanted only Ukrainians. There is a big community of Ukrainians in Portugal, very well inserted, with full rights. They worked since the beginning, it works. Germany did the same, probably have been reading that, with Syrians. Because Syrians are known as big workers, so at some point they stopped. But for 1,500,000 Syrians, they did it. And they gave these rights. And all the Syrians I know, they work. They have also good work sometimes. Of course, they are refugees. They started as refugees, so it's not many years. So the first thing is not to consider they are beggars or, poor people. They will create mess. Give rights and see in which way you can insert, consider them part of your population. For me, this is the first point and the first recipe. The last question I want to give is, again to Romola, is do they want to integrate? I guess everybody that comes wants to integrate, wants to be part. Nobody wants to be an outsider in life. You remain an outsider, of course, in a certain sense, but nobody wants to be an outsider. But there was a wonderful definition by Alessandro. All of us, we have a multiplicity, as he called, of belongings. So you can be inserted and integrated, keeping your multiplicity of belonging. If there is Austria, Iraq in a football match, you can also be for Iraq and not, why not? What is the difference? But then you will respect the rules if you are accepted. You will respect the rules of the society in Austria and in the moment in which you are given the rights as an Austrian citizen. And this is for everywhere else. I can say they made a research for which it seems that the majority of Italians have in the DNA Asian chromosomes. So probably we are all migrants sooner or later. So how we have all majority of Italians have this chromosomes, probably we are all migrants. So we should try to accept the others not as different, but as somebody that maybe is trying to come to us. So you know, when you walk, there are not only streets that are one way. Sometimes there are two ways.
Thank you. I would disagree partially though, because then it comes to this power relationship between the host and the guest, which will be another argument. What are the conditional and unconditional hospitalities, right? But I would like to give the microphone to our audience. I'm sure some of you also have some questions. So I start with you.
Hello, thank you. This question is first to Romola, and because the influx of Syrian refugees in Lebanon is something new and recent, I would say, compared to the Palestinian refugee settlements. I would like to know if you have any thoughts, or it can be personal as well, about the difference between Syrian camps, Palestinian camps in Lebanon, and let's say structure, architecture, contextualization.
The Lebanese government refused to make Syrian camps, not to have the same Palestinian experience. Anyway.
Any other answer from the group?
One, or do you want to collect more than one?
I think you can answer and then we collect more.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I'm going to just start with your question first. Yes, as Mario pointed out, that, and I wrote that I've done a paper on this already. Syrians don't live in camps in Lebanon. There are Syrian camps because the Lebanese government did not want a repeat of the Palestinian situation. So because of the Palestinian experience, they decided that there will be no official camps in Lebanon. Syrians live in two kinds of spaces. They live in either informal tented settlements or informal settlements, however you want to talk about them, because talking about tents is another can of worms with the Lebanese government. Or they live in urbanized or urbanizing areas, and they live in sort of informal, they live more informally in different private rented accommodation. So they live in everything from apartments to converted garages, all kinds of different places. And so that's sort of it's a very complicated landscape of Syrians in the country, and there's a varied landscape also based on geography. Depends on whether they're in the south of the country or whether in the DAAR or somewhere else. So there's a much more complicated geography of that. The Palestinian camps, you can say that, if you look at the history of Palestinian camps in Lebanon, in many ways it kind of, some of the camps also started in that kind of informal manner, but they have become, as you look at the Hesha camp, that it is very similar, that they are these sort of, they are concrete spaces, and they're not just so. Julie Petit, for example, wrote many years ago a really beautiful anthropological book called Landscape of Hope and Despair, in which she talks about the ways in which the camp has evolved so much that it's not just Palestinians who live in these camps, but there are also migrants who live in these camps, and now Palestinians from Syria also live in these camps. So it's a very complicated landscape as well within these kinds of camps. But given the sort of specificity of the Syrian crisis and the fact that it's quite new, that it is much more more temporary structures at the moment, or scattering of Syrians through other parts of the country, and the vast majority not actually living in informal settlements. I just want to say something about the points that were raised about legal divisions between people and looking at migrants and refugees. And there's been a fair bit of work that many of us have been doing on looking at legal geographies around refuge as well. I want to give an anecdote here. I'm originally from India, and I went back to doing work in India, and I'm going back again to doing work in India because I have continued to sort of be engaged in the country that I grew up in. If you look at the sort of politics of landlessness within the South Asian context, whether we're talking about India, or we're talking about Bangladesh, or we're talking about any other countries in India, there have been lots of scholars who've kind of talked about this. There are lots of very complex reasons as to why people become landless, and these are questions around caste, around tribal identity, around communalism, all kinds of things. And they are becoming much more salient today, especially under the current circumstances. I had interviewed a political leader in India many years ago when I was talking about the refugee colonies. And I quote, he said to me that, we have supported refugees who came in from East Pakistan and later from East Pakistan and later from Bangladesh because they were refugees, they needed our help because they came having escaped violence in their countries. And I asked him, do you extend the same support to the migrants who live in the squatter settlements and slums in these places, many of whom are landless peasants and do not have the possibility of going back to their lands either, and have also faced enormous violence. And Laura Hammond in her work actually raises a very interesting question of why do we talk about internally displaced people instead of talking about them as being citizens? And he said that we don't support them because they're migrants. They've come here for selfish reasons. They've come here because of economic reasons, and they can just go back. And I find this kind of division, and many migration scholars also find it really problematic to differentiate between people who've escaped from structural forms of violence and episodic forms of violence. And there's a lot of discussion we can have about this. But in effect, there's been a rich discussion about the sort of complex reasons as to why people leave and how they overlap with each other. That said, I also very much take your point about that we need to be really nuanced about when we think about these issues. In my PhD, one of the things that I was arguing about is that in fact, shelter becomes the way in which to differentiate between refugees and citizens. So in a country like Lebanon, you give them the quote-unquote right to shelter because they can be refugees in that country. But you take all other rights away from them. You take away the rights to work. You take away the rights to mobility. And you effectively imprison them in a particular place. So actually, legal status matters considerably. And there's a lot of work that a lot of people are doing, in fact, about precisely the ways in which but we're looking at refugees, but even people, and more in this, I was kind of alluding to this in the talk, that people who go outside of the refugee camp are in an even more vulnerable situation, not because they've escaped the camp, but because they're even more precarious, because they're even more subject to exploitation, because people know that they're not supposed to be outside of the camps. And the police, like in Thailand, for example, police will extort money from them on a regular basis because they know that UNHCR gives them their monthly stipends at certain times and so on. So I do think that legal status, in fact, does matter, and we do need to take this into account. Yeah.
Discrimination.
Yeah.
No, but because you were asking why the refugees that go in the city, they don't get the same kind of protection, is because exactly there is a different protection in the status, and this make them much more poor as living in a room with
exactly, but my counterpoint to that would be, and this is something that I've also discussed in my PhD, is that the counterpoint to that is precisely going back to this exchange with the political person that I interviewed, is that if you look at that at people who live in informal settlements and so forth, who are also working 3 to 5 jobs a day, they have the right to work and the right to mobility, but they don't have the right to shelter. You see informal settlements being demolished on a regular basis. So I think that that kind of interplay actually becomes really interesting, kind of talking about those relationships between different groups of people.
I can add about the experience of your neighbor country, Italy, with an example. In Florence, because of the law of the previous government, that you know it was a very right-wing, I'm going to work with migrant women with a workshop in some months, and I asked how many migrant women, and they told me only 70 in Florence. I said, but in your booklet last year was 1,400. Yeah, but you know, most of them, they lost the status because the government in one day cancelled the status of economic migrants or whoever migrants that were refugees actually, that were not for war reason. All of them lost the status and they are illegal all of a sudden in Italy, from day 1 to day 2. So all of a sudden you have these people losing. And last thing, which is important, is that anyway about Lebanon, for example, in the camp, 30% of, in the Palestinian camps, I'm saying, 30% today are Syrians, because they came with a possibility, economic possibility to rent a house. And this creates some big issues at the moment, because they have been welcomed very much by the Palestinians, but the question is that all the funding, because of how it works our Western world, that has priorities. Now it's the Syrian, tomorrow we don't think about the Syrians anymore and so on. So all the money goes to the Syrians. And so the Palestinians say, okay, you know, we even gave them our houses and so on, and we don't get anything. And even we don't get the same status. So, for example, speaking of Annika Nafani that has this kindergarten, when she made a rule, if you want to fund us, you cannot fund only the Palestinian kids in our kindergarten, but not only the Syrian kids in our kindergarten, but also the Palestinian kids.
So Pamela had a question.
I alerted Alessandro that I was going to ask this question before, but it's going to wander a little bit from the question that I had in mind. And this stemmed from his comment about how, in describing this heritage assignment, heritage, what do you call it? Heritage Foundation, whatever. No, I'm just blanking at thinking about it too long. That it was a colonial or post-colonial concept. So I found that I was trying to wrap my head around that because I didn't see heritage as being anything about colonialism. However, when I looked up the first definition I pulled was heritage, property that is or may be inherited, an inheritance. And that confounded me because I think of heritage more as a cultural and a more thing and more of an abstraction than an object. So the point, what I want to kind of get to maybe with all of you, since we're talking about displacements and what happens when you move from one country to another, and again this goes back to the first project I saw of Alessandro's at the Istanbul Biennale, where they took settlements in Israel and refashioned these properties, as I recall, so that the Palestinians, when they were welcomed to or allowed to move into those properties, they didn't, because the properties carried forward the kind of cultural signifiers of an Israeli lifestyle or living habit. So, with all of that ramble, heritage, culture, displacement, what happens to the culture? How do the cultures morph? And what are the implications of these displacements to heritage and culture?
Yes, I try to. Does it work? Yes. I try to answer. I try to answer by how I felt I understood heritage, and then how by engaging with heritage outside of Europe, you know, I somehow start to question, you know, that notion of heritage. In the Faculty of Architecture in Venice, where I studied, which is, by the way, the Venice Charter was the base for the UNESCO World Heritage criteria. So these were specific peoples, right? These were professionals European architect professionals. They understood history, understood in that sense heritage, which from a very small part of the world, which is called Europe, that has this problem that thinks that what is relevant here is relevant for the planet. So Europeans have this specific attitude that what they think is a certain understanding of culture or heritage, that is what all the rest of the world has to understand. So I was embedded in that kind of culture. Now, what is interesting in engaging UNESCO, not just to say, as some of friends always accuse me, I mean, why you are doing this thing? This is like French, universalism that they pretend it's universal, but it's French, So why you are dealing with this stuff? And my point is, that unless we are seriously destabilizing, still these conceptions that somehow apply to the whole world, certain definitions, and trying to reduce them, to localize them. Because when we talk about heritage in Europe, we understand, for example, in architecture, which is usually a monument, and which is usually a material object. Now, when, for example, after the Second World War, many countries started to join UNESCO, and then they start to discuss among the different objects, they started to discuss, for example, a Buddhist temple, that, since it's made of wood, they have to rebuild every 100 years. So Europeans say, wait a second, this is fake. This is not the monument. You want to ascribe something that, imagine how offensive this could be. They say, are you saying that a Buddhist temple is not heritage? What are we talking about? So it's just one of the several, interesting discussions that UNESCO itself, is made of. The other big shift, for example, has been, finally, because, we have to say that until now, in UNESCO, half of the property are actually in Europe. So half of the property of all over the world are in Europe, and half of that are in Italy. Okay, so heritage today for UNESCO means Italian monuments. In fact, this is what we have in mind. When we think about heritage, that is what we have in mind. So imagine also when people start to discuss also about form of heritage and culture in that sense, also that don't materialize. What is this bloody fetishism that Europeans have to impose to others, that only if it becomes a material object, then, which is typically men, in fact, architects, they always tend to think, in that kind of, narrow definition of monuments, that needs to be a material object and needs to be old, made of old stuff. That is heritage.
It's called phallic object.
Yeah. So, in a way, I think that is why, at some point, I become so obsessed, because I say that is obscene. They are continuing, to celebrate these sites. Using these bloody criteria that, mainly old people over 70 years old, more of them men, that had a specific education, great education, but they were, people that understood this were starting from Venice. Now, one of the interesting things, you have not noticed that maybe you did, in the images that I showed of the camp, there were 2 images from Venice. And this is also part of the exhibition, so I always play this trick. When people goes there and say, oh my God, this is a camp, and they're just having 2 of these images, which is actually Venice. That for everyone is like such a beautiful place, is actually the essence of a sort of monumental and heritage city, but they don't recognize it. Why? For several reasons. First of all, because what is called, in technical terms, minor Venice, is actually self-built. It's a technical slums, where no architects involved, they were doing the monuments. But the rest of Venice, what we today enjoy when we walk, this was basically done by the people, and was today would be called slums, self-built architecture in some ways. But also importantly to remember, and this is also interesting, somehow part of the beginning of this trick because it goes back to a little bit my personal history with Venice, where I studied and I did my study there. Is also that Venice was in fact a refugee city.
these were people that were escaping from the so-called invasions, of northern Italy. And the first settlements that they built, it was called Torcello. Okay, and then after Torcello, they started to build all the islands. So, in fact, one of the big questions is to say, how come that also the sort of, the best European culture that is actually based on this Venice Charter, where then UNESCO was inspired, the UNESCO Charter was inspired from, is actually based on the aesthetics and on the and the material culture that refugee actually at that time built. So that also what it does, these different perspectives. It's a time that we destabilize certain conception of what, and especially in Europe. I mean, that is a very important work that needs to be done from here, which is how, from the perspective of the camp and from other perspectives, we start to destabilize certain understanding of what constitutes heritage, what constitutes culture, that we should start to somehow reduce them to a local history. It doesn't mean that it's not important, I'm not saying that. But that is just one of the millions of different ways on which we can understand heritage, which is not just one way of defining it. Because otherwise we go back to this, we get rid of the colonialism and then it goes back somehow in our mind. We are still somehow based on this, on the same values.
Thank you. So officially, 5 minutes ago, our discussion ended. Can we have like a few more minutes for a few more questions? Because
you mentioned it before that Ukrainians refugees in Portugal had more rights than in Germany.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they were invited to come to Portugal. There was a quota that it was already in the European Union. They were speaking of quota. It was a way to avoid the quotas. So instead of having, let's say, African refugees or something, we take the Ukrainian that we know that they work, they will insert well, they are anyway European and white, and even Christian, and which is something that usually is considered quite important in Europe. And then instead of taking people that come from a Muslim background and so on, so they invited and they said, okay, we did for our quota, we don't want other refugees anymore. And Germany has done the same for Syrians.
Yeah, they have quotas, but my question is...
I don't know if anymore. This was after the dissolution.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just curious, why, for example, Ukrainian had more rights than Syrian, if it's because different national regulations in country. For example, I worked with international agreement between Ukraine and Germany in the ministry, and I know that to make agreement, it have to go together with national regulation. So if it depends of national regulations, what you can give to refugees, if there is this direct correlation between it?
We think that laws are just what we read, but laws are interpreted by human beings. And unfortunately, in our culture, European culture, we find that is very dangerous today, or most of the people think that is very dangerous today, to dilute with 9%. If you put 9% of a different liquid in the water, it will not even color probably. But it seems that it will dilute and create a big issue if somebody would come from a different... So this, first of all, is the interpretation. And second, about the quota was really low. They said, okay, we want and we invite you. This was for Portugal, and this was, for Syria was a practical thing.
If we can be very brief about the questions and the answers, I think we can take two more. One is here.
Yeah, actually, I'm interested in some more ideas on this terminologies and definitions, because I totally agree with you. On a personal, individual level, the legal status is super relevant. But if we look at these spaces as architects and urban researchers, and also with my background in looking at urban space in West African cities, for example, like the discourse nowadays about formality and informality, it's not a binary thing anymore. It's all melting into each other. And also, to me, this looking at camps, it's not isolated islands. And so I wonder if, I mean, that goes to you, Alessandro, maybe also in reference to your project. I think it's really a fantastic thing, this heritage topic, but if I see the latest photo of this camp, and if I wouldn't know, and if I would walk around, most probably I wouldn't identify the borders of that or the difference to like what is next. And therefore I think it would also be interesting looking like from a like spatial, phenomenological level to not look at this otherness and the difference, but the what is in common, and also like this being embedded. And like one of my students, he looked at, in Harsham camp, he looked at the channels of distribution of food, and he identified that it's like strongly related to all these wholesale markets in Erbil town, so it's not isolated. And also like this question, what is the difference between a camp and a slum? I wonder if we should, if it wouldn't help us if we go beyond these categorizations, because they don't help us in understanding these spaces.
Only one thing, because I don't want to take the word from Alessandro. Only one thing, it's a question of rights, really established rights. And I tell you, we were speaking of bias that you, of course I have. I don't know, if I were a refugee, the biggest right that I would lose by becoming an asylum seeker is the right of resettlement. If you lose the right of, if you are not a refugee anymore, and you become an asylum seeker, so you are an asylum seeker in that country. If you are a refugee, you have the right of resettlement where there is a space for you, which means that you come with a work, with a house, with something. And this is something that I find, but of course I'm not a refugee, so I'm thinking from my Western perspective. I find that is quite a huge difference.
Yeah, about also the terminologies, right? I think that is a very relevant question. Also, I guess is relevant also to specifically the fact that we are in a university. And I think that was, for example, one important moment in which we also trying to locate our specific work and our specific struggle from the position, instead of, you know, representing, instead of speaking in the name of others, and so far and so on, is actually what's in the moment that you work, for example, in university, there is a lot of work needs to be done in terms of definitions, you know, in terms of experiencing things and then giving naming to things. So for our experience, that is what I witnessed very strongly when we established a campus in camps as a university in a refugee camp. That's where we started to work really with concepts. Because somehow we realized, you know, that in order to engage with that situations, you know, our architectural vocabulary were absolutely useless. So, and that was an incredible moment in which also the people that were involved somehow experienced an incredible possibility to become agent of the situation that we were living, and not just the object of study. So even when, for example, we were inviting people, you know, in this discussion, that was always something that we were proposing to transgress that sort of relation. Anthropologists coming and writing together with refugees and not about refugees. But more importantly, that is part of the, I have this list that says if I go out from Palestine, I have to finish writing this book, and that is one book that I really want to finish, which is based on the work of Campus in Camps. They was trying exactly, for example, to work on categories that are emerging from the camp that allowed, for example, thinking what is the camp? Is it the public or a private? You know, just very briefly, when you are an architect and you enter the camp, you know, and you are in an urban environment, you tend to understand the city that way. You know, what is the public space, the private space, and usually, in fact, you know, we have been educated also as an architect, the public is always good, you know. If you do something for the public, you are the good person, the private is bad. Now, in a context like Palestine,
you first of all discover if the public is a colonial state, the public is actually the entity that expropriates private land, but also, for example, a lot of collective lands, the territories, right? So one of the things that for us was, become very important was, to get rid of this kind of public-private divisions and try to nominate all the different forms of collectivity or living in common that were completely erased on this nation-state-based idea of what constitutes, the territory and how you build a society. And that's why, for example, in that specific case, the camp was for us the space of Masha, which is an Arabic word that was used during the Ottoman period, that was defining at that time, historically, was defining the land that was cultivated in common. And the difference from the public was that in the moment people were stopping to cultivate the land, that will go back to a previous entity. There could have been the Waqf, different kind of entity that were not necessarily the state. So the interesting part for us was understanding that, for example, there are forms of communality that require the active participation of the citizen. This is a concept that at the moment in Western society we are incapable to think about. Because we are only thinking about the public, and the public is given to us by the state. And the state, if you want to demonstrate in the public, and many demonstrations, by the way, there is a whole history that it's really interesting to look into. But the demonstrations now are impossible to make in the public state. Why? Because the public state doesn't belong to the people anymore. This belongs to the state, right? And the only fraction, that we can work with, and if you look at all protests where they were happening, were always in this crack in between the private and the public. So one of the important work, I guess, that we have to do in university, instead of just transforming ourselves in activists, many times I was told by my friends on the ground, say, you have a PhD, you teach, you read so many books, why you are here? Go, and do other works that you're supposed to do. Not, this we can do it. And the work I think we have to do, maybe as activists inside university, is also work really on our materials, which is knowledge production, there is so many things that call off for engaging in terms of conceptualizations. And that is a very important work. It's not abstract work. Let's not fall into this kind of, stupid idea, it's only when it becomes activist, that things matters. No. There is also very important work needs to be done in terms of really being precise, on terminologies, on concepts. They are not just speculation per se, but they are related to, very important form of life. And trying to reopen, for example, this kind of dichotomy between private and public. How many other kind of form of life we can imagine that are not private and not public? Can we imagine, a society that is able to build something like that? Because historically we lived many times, in a society in which people were, living together, not mediated by the state. But today everything is mediated by the state. And even refugees, we're talking about refugees, by the way, this I close it. Because the footnote is, we only think about hospitalities through the state. Can we imagine hospitality where you are involved personally? In Italy, if you host someone, you can be imprisoned. That is the moment, this is the time that we live in. Can you imagine? So this is not the problem.
In the sea as well. This
is not the problem of the refugees. This is the problem of the citizen, that we have not realized the state has taken already a lot of rights, including the right to hospitality, to you, citizen. Forget about the refugees. You as a citizen, you already lost your right to have someone in your house and host that person. In Italy, you are put into prison because you do that. Isn't this an invasion of what you think should be your right? So that also is reversing, this logic of, we do things for them. No, that is only, again, to understand how, in crazy situation we are into, but then asking the question, how that affect to me, my supposedly, normal life.
Thank you very much. I think this is a good point to stop. We can continue a little bit further the conversations between us. Thank you very much all staying until very late, and thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. Thank you.